Good evening, and welcome to the annual Haidostian lecture. It's wonderful to see so many people here, actually, braving the weather. In the morning, we were contemplating actually postponing this lecture, and then thanks to some unnamed members of the Haidostian family, quoting actually the spirit of their father, that he would have been here and he would have gone on. We decided to have it. And in fact, this dramatic shift of weather from a blizzard to this beautiful sun was testimony to, in fact, the good choice and fortunate choice that we've made. The Haidostian annual lecture series was actually initiated in the name of Dr. Berj Haidostian, a prominent physician, as well as a very active member of Armenian Studies program and the University of Michigan at large. I am very thankful and would like to personally extend my thanks to the Haidostian family who are here tonight. Alice Haidostian, the spouse of the late Dr. Berj Haidostian, and his children who made it here tonight, Cynthia Haidostian Wilbanks, as well as Dikran Haidostian, was the first time I've met, and it's quite a character. It's thanks to him that we're here actually tonight. I'm sorry that Christine Haidostian Gary was unable to make it here from Chicago, but this is videotaped, and so hopefully she will be able to listen to it. It's really a very beautiful complementary program that we have, these annual Haidostian lectures, along with the Manoogian family endowments and donations that we have, in that we're able to every year bring in a new group of cutting-edge scholars from all over the world, postdocs as well as visiting fellows, and graduate students who are able to take advantage. I see some of them in the crowd here who are really able to take advantage of all of these people who are doing wonderful work around the world, and also take the future of Armenian studies into these places that are very fruitful, rich, and productive. In the last few years, we have an annual lecture. In the last few years, we have favored visual culture and the performative arts. We had the director Atom Egoyan here 2 years ago. Last year we had Eric Bogosian, the actor, playwright, and now historian. A tough act to follow for Maria Od Baronian, but as you will see, she will rise to this occasion brilliantly. I would also like to thank our co-sponsors tonight, the Screen Arts and Cultures program, SACS, as well as PICS. We like acronyms here at the University of Michigan, the Program for International Comparative Studies. They helped sponsor, actually, Marie Baronian's visit, as well as this lecture tonight. And last but not least, I'd like to thank the invisible labor that has made this event, despite all odds, such an efficient and fluid matter. Zana Kweiser and Gita Kilu, thank you so much. You're a wonderful team to work with. And now to introduce our guest lecturer tonight, Marie Od Baronian. Professor Baronian is the 2014 Manoogian visiting professor at the University of Michigan, housed, as I said, in the Screen Arts and Cultures program, and co-sponsored, as far as her stay here, by the Program of International and Comparative Studies. She's an associate professor in film and visual culture in the University of Amsterdam, where she received her PhD in the very prestigious program and School for Cultural Analysis in 2004. She received her BA from the Saint Louis University in Brussels, and she majored in philosophy and French. And I think tonight you'll see that this merging of disciplines of philosophy and visual cultures really brings in a particular richness to her analysis of the visual. Baronyan's research focuses on an impressive range of topics, from Armenian diasporic visual culture to ethics and aesthetics, as well as French thought. She is currently completing a book on Lévinas and film, which she herself says is a challenging project since the philosopher Lévinas never wrote about cinema. She's also interested in the archive. Obviously, the question of the archive is so essential when one considers and studies the genocide itself, and she looks at memory, the ways in which this archive or lack thereof creates particular kinds of remembrance of the genocide. One of the key philosophical questions Baronyan wonders about in her work is how can we remember a trauma like that of the Armenian genocide without a visual archive? A few graphic images of this violent event exist, but they do not circulate in the public sphere. Baronyan sees filmic fiction as a way to respond to the state of denial, a site that in fact renders genocide a fiction itself. But what sort of testimony is at stake through the medium of film or of plastic arts? And how are we to create a collective imaginary? Baronyan studies contemporary filmmakers and visual artists in diaspora, like Atom Egoyan, in her Cinéma et Mémoire sur Atom Egoyan, published in 2013 in Brussels itself, and Garine Torosyan, another Armenian-Canadian filmmaker, best known for her film A Girl from Manouche, who you'll be seeing a clip of tonight, and Mechitar Garabedian, the poster, if any of you have been able to see it, as well as the cover of Marie's other 2013 book, Mémoire et Image, Memory and Image, a look at the Armenian catastrophe. It is, this one in particular is a work with pencil on paper of the Armenian alphabet. So these visual artists, she looks at and analyzes the way in which they represent the genocide by recreating images in the present that remain obsessively connected to the past. Baronyan looks at various strategies that artists bring to sight that do compensate for this lack of representation. But also more profoundly, she interrogates the very status of images for diasporic communities in today's visual culture. Baronyan brings a personal witnessing to her passionate endeavor. A few years ago, she finds out that a video exists of her grandfather, Sisak, a survivor of the genocide, who passed away in 1919. The video records his narrative of the genocide, and I'm quoting Marie Baronyan. I saw my grandfather alive in the video. For the first time, I recognized traces of the genocide, despite the silence and what it provokes. I never saw the video again. I never really had to. What matters, after all, is that it is here, that it exists. Tonight, despite her fall in the icy winter vortex, which we have greeted her with in Ann Arbor, she has made it bravely here to tell us about the value of images for Armenian diasporic communities. Please join me in welcoming Mariot Baronyan.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for this wonderful introduction. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to express my warmest thanks to two wonderful women who run the program, the Armenian Studies program, in a very efficient, active, and inspiring way. And I mean Catherine Babayan and Zana Kweiser. I also would like to thank, of course, the members of the Haidostian family who are here tonight for making this event possible, as well as the Manogan Simon Foundation and the Alex and Mary Manogan Foundation for facilitating my stay in Michigan. And lastly, thanks to all of you for being here, my friends, my colleagues, and even my students. My lectures is mainly inspired by two of my most recent books that Catherine has briefly introduced. So those two books are in French, unfortunately not yet in English. One of them will be translated into Armenian next year. So my talk is based on years of analysis and research, through which, generally speaking, I was attempting to understand the link between remembering and images, or remembering and filmic images. The project I delve into is, of course, very ambitious, and as Atom Egoyan, as you said, was already here, and as I know that some of you are already familiar with his work, I will take tonight the opportunity to present and introduce you to other visual artists with occasional references to Egoyan. First, let me explain the subtitle of my talk, Textures of Memory in Diaspora. It describes a textural form of memory which I define as a diasporic remembering practice consisting of collage and textile. From these two last terms, so collage and textile, I borrow at once an ancestral form of weaving, and let's think of tapestries and carpets, but also, in a more metaphorical way, a cultural, if not existential, form of assembling and disassembling codes, signs, lexicons, and all sorts of visual textures. Ultimately, this textural remembering practice translates the desire to transmit and connect the past to tangible materials in the here and now, rather than replicating evidentiary documents that support a culture marked, for instance, by genocidal past. As French historian Jean-Marie Carzou phrased it, the Armenian genocide is a perfect one because it never took place. In that sense, denial is not only part of the very origin of the genocide, but also of its accomplishment, since every trace of the catastrophic event was meant to disappear. The genocide has always already occurred as if nothing actually occurred, which is often the reason why I argue that fiction is profoundly constitutive of the genocide. Indeed, as we know too well, the genocide of 1915 was followed by a long and persistent campaign of denial that still agitated the Armenian diasporic community in the search for a sense of home. The planned destruction of a people has thus been pursued and amplified in this active policy of negation. As a result, Armenians in Western diaspora continuously feel the need to accommodate visual evidence in order to validate their inherited historical past. This is also the reason why we can speak of a transgenerational trauma. And here I refer, for example, to the work of Janine Altounian, but also Marianne Hirsch and Carol Bardenstein, who is here tonight. Because there are at least few filmic images of the genocidal history, and because those that do exist are not circulated in the public visual sphere, the very status of images and their publicity is very much at stake here. Let me now briefly comment on the main title of my lecture, Missing Images. I do believe it is relevant to focus on images when considering the genocide in our contemporary world. The reason for this goes beyond the general but nevertheless legitimate idea that much of our ability to remember the past depends on images and archival objects. However, the more pronounced motivation for concentrating on the image is, as I indicated, and Catherine also, that there are relatively few visual representations of the genocide that circulate, at least outside of the circle of intimacy and community. Some photographs do exist, however, somehow these are not part of the collective visual memories, nor of a public and thus accessible depository. Most Armenians themselves did not really grow up with explicit images which could have helped them imagine or have access to the catastrophic event. It is true that the historical precedents for this absence of images cannot be ignored. The fact that there is insufficient visual evidence of the genocide must be linked to the politics of extermination practiced in relation to any record in form which explicitly demonstrate the will to negate the genocide. No images of the Armenian genocide could be disseminated since visual evidence of the massacre was rare, and if available, it was mostly destroyed or kept hidden. This was, of course, a logical exponent of the genocidal policy. In other words, the Armenian genocide is seen not only as a non-event, but also as a kind of non-document, as it remains unrecorded and unrepresented. This explains the rather complex relation Armenians have towards images in general. In a way, there is a constant desire to reconstruct and vindicate the past by any visible means available. It is, for instance, the reason why the work of Atom Egoyan, and specifically the film Ararat, is very important. The two artists I would like to introduce you today, namely Garini Torosyan and Mehritar Garabedian, do not really aim at filling for good that gap by spreading images in the public space. Rather, the relevance is that they question and reflect upon this very invisibility. Another commonality is that neither of them work with images as vehicles of proof. Indeed, if the function of the images was to certify and authenticate the genocide, then images would serve the demands of the perpetrator, who claims that the absence of authentic images indicates the lack of proof that the genocide actually took place. Such perversity, as I call it, of repetitive justification and explanation is what the perpetrator wants for the victims and their heirs to have to prove over and over again that something happened. Torosyan and Garabedian's creative enterprise is mostly a fictional one. As I wish to insist, this is not only related to the fact that they are artists who obviously make and create fictional images, but also to the more profound fact that fiction, even if it might seem paradoxical, is an appropriate response to a genocide which is still considered to be a fictional event or an event that did not leave any traces. In a sense, the artists provide us with what I call imaginary archives, that is to say, documents that do not replicate the historical factuality in its wholeness, but that translate the need to anchor the past and to literally imagine it. They develop distinctive filmic strategies, be them artificial, in order to recall the Armenian legacy and to question its imposing nature without duplicating its factuality. As I have often argued and emphasized, Atom Egoyan's work is not confined by Armenian-related issues, but also touches more generally on the precariousness and fragility of both the traumatic event and the very being of images. Like Egoyan, both Torosyan and Garabedian are interested in the process of making images or responding to images. Their work is animated by a sort of messianic, though implicit, desire to fill the void of history by creating and constructing alternative and thus imaginary archives. This implicitly messianic desire resonates with one of the main characters in the film Ararat, Rafi. Rafi is this young Armenian who decides to go to Turkey and shoot natural footage of the land on video. And at a certain moment in the film, he says, and I just want to quote what Rafi says in the film, "When I see these places, I realize how much we've lost. Not just the land and the lives, but the loss of any way to remember it. There is nothing here to prove that anything ever happened," unquote. The multitude of mnemonic artifacts in Ararat, I just want to remind you, a video diary, a painting, a photograph, a film, combined with the use of various visual means, conjure up multiple possibilities for anchoring the catastrophic legacy, as well as the impossibility of capturing it for good in a unique and transparent visual surface. Moreover, the film Ararat reveals the chronotopic effects of objects as they travel from different time and space through generations. This is exactly what I call the aesthetics of displacement, that results in acts of framing the genocide across generations, which I will approach today as textures of memory, an ongoing practice of weaving and bringing texture to the fragility involved in the process of remembering a delicate and haunting past. Images thus reflect the experience of displacement, the displacement of a people, of a history and of a territory. In other words, the scattering experience is somehow replaced in new imaginary sites that translate the paradoxical desire to return without actually wanting to go back. Archival objects or visual anchors are pivotal for the inscription of both the catastrophic event and a certain cultural mythology that is somehow promoted and intensified when approached from a diasporic angle. Let me briefly present you the work of another Canadian filmmaker, Gary Haidostian, who's a bit younger than Egoyan, was mainly operating within the circle of experimental cinema. And I just want to add that there is a long tradition of experimental cinema in Canada. So in the work of Gary Haidostian, born in Lebanon, the textural dimension, as you will see, is all the more at the core of her work. Her films are characterized as collage. She assembles different images, mostly photographic, after they have been taken from the original context. The collage often results in a repetitive and obsessive configuration of images. In the film Girl from Mush, that's a film she made in 1993, and one of her early films actually, is a collection of images of the homeland Armenia. In this film, Torosian expresses a sense of belonging to those images, but also their foreignness and exoticism. The film is a sort of pictorial pilgrimage to Armenia. Girl from Mush is not about the genocide. It does not address it directly. But one allusion to the tragic history can perhaps be found in the relevance of the title. Indeed, Mush was one of the main sites of the massacres and deportations. The film, you will see that in a minute, is a collage of handmade found footage from various formats. It includes, you will see, reproduction from picture books, calendar images, still photographs depicting churches and other Christian signs, landscape portraits, all kinds of artworks like manuscript, Armenian graphics, and architectural details. The images appear to be very grainy. Many frames are scratched, which give the impression of oldness and archive. Actually, the images are photos of photographs copied onto Super 8 and then shot on 16mm. Most of the images are repetitive, fast-moving and shaky, except from some of the images of the churches. With each image, the viewer is therefore obliged to take on an attentive and concentrated role in order to distinguish and identify every detail. So I suggest to show you the entire film. It's only 5 minutes. And I also want to emphasize the music and the soundtrack, which hopefully you can also recognize.
Echmiadzin, Yerevan, Sireli, Hayastan.
Some of the cultural figures, like the churches that we've seen in the film, are postcard images of the ancestral country, images that are commonly shared in the Western Armenian diaspora. These images contain nostalgic and even fetishistic aspects, and it is well known how fetishistic images can connote absence and death. Also, let's keep in mind that more than 1,000 churches were destroyed during the massacre. Thus, the inclusion of images of church crystallizes the specificity of Armenian cultural history and acts as a displaced icon for the history of the catastrophe. By combining and reshaping her images, Torossian emphasizes and perhaps even exaggerates the erratic value of these churches. The technique of the collage enables a reflection on the role of images while pointing to what has been lost. In fact, some of the images of the churches she used are taken from Atom Egoyan's feature film Calendar that he made in 1993. A film, as some of you remember, tells the story of a Canadian photographer who goes to Armenia in order to make a calendar based on pictures of churches. A calendar which supposedly will be consumed by Armenians in the Western diaspora. By visually quoting and recycling Egoyan, Torossian confirms and accentuates the iconic value of the church, which now travel through the Armenian imaginary. Such construction of filmic memories based on cliché of Armenian cultural anchors, and here I use the word cliché in the double sense of the French word, which means similarly stereotypes and snapshots. So the construction of these filmic memories based on those clichés is further echoed in the portrait of Armenian filmmaker Sergei Parajanov. And you could see at different moments the man with the beard. That's a portrait of the filmmaker, mostly famous for the film The Color of the Pomegranates that he made in 1971. So, and this portrait appears several times in Girl from Mush. So Girl from Mush outlines that to be Armenian is to identify with the homeland and the visually transmitted memories inherited by the Armenians in diaspora. And I don't know if you noticed at a certain point in the film, you also hear her speaking in Armenian and in English, and at a certain point she says, and I quote, "I feel connected to every Armenian I meet," unquote. So this reflects a certain naivete quite specific to diaspora. One of the only things the Armenians have in common is the imagined land and its tragic history. Even if the homeland is today identifiable on the map and exists spatially, it nevertheless remains imagined, because most Armenians in the Western diaspora, like Torossian at the time she made the film, has never lived or has never physically been there. The only access to the land is through the process of a visual and virtual journey. Torossian cuts and pastes, physically reshaping the images as she deconstructs, reconstructs, and redefines a commitment and fascination for the Armenian ancestors. As she also once said, and that's very relevant for the title of this lecture, a way of working with film is a reminder of the women in her family who were knitting and weaving linens and carpets. In a film, which are literally handmade, Torossian texture, so to speak, the images. The frenetic patchwork quality of the film makes the viewer aware of the diversity of images that construct the film. This diversity, however, nevertheless recalls the absence or the forgetting of many other images. Some of those invisible images are omitted and left out of the film because they are either unrepresentable, historically absent, or neglected. The image that remain does refer to an absence, but they also indicate an overly present obsession precisely because of this absence. The images of Armenia are in that sense extra iconic because they have been overly cherished and intensified in the diaspora experience. Pictures of Armenia thus become mythological images that circulate not only in the home, but also in the collective unconsciousness. To reiterate, what Girl from Mich vividly shows is not only that the genocide is an obsession that haunts Armenians in the Western diaspora, but also that the heritage of the catastrophe can only be imagined. The images do not depict the catastrophe in a figurative way, but they do confirm and substantiate Armenianness, an ethnic identity that the genocidal impulse logically tends to make disappear. Furthermore, the acts of making images, even if they are not Armenian, specifically Armenian in content, and the acts of creating various visual trajectories constitute an artistic and simultaneously ethical response to the missing images. Now, I would like to turn to the artist Mechita Garabedian. So Garabedian is a Belgian Armenian artist born in Syria who has also been living in Lebanon. Is in the mid-30s, is not, I'm very glad to present it today because it's not known in the United States, while in Belgium he's becoming an important artist who has already many retrospectives in important European contemporary museums. So the work of Garabedian is multimedial and multi-referential, but altogether very consistent. His references are indeed multiple: cinema, literature, graphic arts, music, etc. I will show you some of his works that specifically take over and deconstruct some of those Armenian codes and cultural signs. And yet, I should specify that issues of Armenianness are not the exclusive motifs of his work. Besides that, Garabedian's work is worthy of our attention due to its plastic qualities and its artistic interventions. In short, he works with and through his Armenian identity without thereby restricting his practice to an ethnographic or ethnocentric quest. So what I'm going to show you is a few works that he made between 2005 and 2010 that actually disclose how memory and visual media interconnect. I'm just first going to show you one of his videos on DVD, and I have to specify that the way we're going to see this video is not the way we should see it. It's supposed to be on a video monitor in a space, in a gallery space, in the so-called white cube. So this is a bit different than it's supposed to be, but at least you get an idea of what consists this video. So, and the title is actually a German title. I'm sorry for my German accent also. Hören Sie die Stille, which means listen to the silence. And that's a work he made in 2007. That's part of the work, huh? The breaks. So maybe I should translate also the sentence, which is in German, and if I'm correct, what it says, so you don't hear this terrible voice that screams over the horizon and that we usually call silence. What I want to say about this sentence, which is very typical of what Garabedian always does, is that it's actually a sentence that he took from the film Kasperhausen by Werner Herzog, a film that Herzog made in 1974, and the same lines were actually coming from the book of a German writer, Böckner. So that's usually what he does. He always takes sentences and from other media. So, Listen to the Silence is a 3-minute video that depicts a very dark still image, archival footage. We are shown a broken video with horizontal white lines that from time to time disturb the image. Also, the soundtrack, is it a radio signal, is barely audible, and yet, despite the breaks and the non-transparency of the picture, an imagery of deportation based on a photograph of the forced march would be disclosed. This resistance to effortless perception punctuates precisely that which is not seen and heard in the first place. The descriptive element we would need to fully identify the visual source, namely the traumatic history, are somehow not really essential in order to measure the topos of silence. The disturbing and confronting images reinforce the idea of puzzling over the void in history. So now I want to turn to the PowerPoint and show you, so that's the name of. So here we have a work he made in 2010, The Artist and His Mother, Replica Gorky. Following Egoyan and Torosian, who both made films on their Armenian American patent Arshil Gorky. You know, Egoyan used Gorky in the film Ararat, but he also made another short film in 1995 about Gorky. And Torosian made another collage film as an homage to Gorky in 2004. So Garabedian, what he does, he also gives his own interpretation and configuration of the significance of the painter in his own practice. In this work, he reproduced Gorky's famous painting and reworks it by replacing, I don't know if you can see that, but obviously with a sense of irony, the face with those of his own and his mother's. It's very subtle. Huh? You have to know the painting. Arshil Gorky serves as a major entry point into the appropriation of the genocide. The painting by Garabedian refers to Gorky's self-portrait, which was based on the precious photograph of the painter and his mother, taken in Armenia before the genocide. Garabedian acts of appropriation, or perhaps should we say identification, clearly underscore how many Armenians constantly use this painting as an emblem of the genocide survivor. It translates the need for iconic references to legitimate historical silence. From a formal aspect, it corroborates Garabedian's play on the self-portrait and the way he likes to extend and exceed this type of artistic configuration. It is as though an act of memory requires an act of recasting. So that's the work which is used on the poster and on the cover of one of my books, Fig à comme alphabet, from 2009-2010. This work, mainly graphic, evokes the learning process of properly writing the Armenian alphabet and the ways it is practiced by pupils who write letters over and over again in the copybooks. It exposes both the cultural memory of the Armenian alphabet as well as the functioning of memory, since it is a scholarly mnemonic device. Garabedian has extended this repetitive device into various artistic forms by repeating the same technique in diverse formats and materials. This is another version, so with white pencil. And this is a version with pencil on the wall of the gallery it was exposed. To write over and over again in order to master this alphabet, but also to inscribe over and over again for preserving the continuity and persistence of this cultural index. And this is another version, which is a hand woven on a carpet. So two central and significant landmarks are condensed: the Armenian alphabet and, of course, the Oriental carpets. So now I'm going to move on to another. This is another view with, you know, also the page. This work, entitled Daniel Varoujan, Ghent 2011, perfectly conjugates the question of quotations, reference of the historical blank. This installation refers, as an homage to the conceptual and minimal work of American-Cuban artist Felix Gonzalez Torres. In particular, Torres is known for his stacks and accumulation of paper. It is a high pile of blank posters on which are inscribed in white on white, but in relief, certain words in the Armenian alphabet, coming from verses from Armenian poet Daniel Varoujan, who was actually assassinated in 1915 on the night of April 24. With this artwork, Garabedian is touching on unknown pages of history. Varoujan, who is for the non-Armenian public relatively unknown, studied in Ghent. Ghent is a city in Belgium, from 1906 to 1909. In a similar vein, the work entitled crystallizes the cultural origin and the catastrophic legacy of the artist, as well as his here and now, since Ghent is the place where Garabedian actually lives. The words on the poster are obviously incomprehensible for the visitors or for the viewers, even if they could take a poster of the exhibition along and thus take a part in this misunderstood and incomprehensible history in order to appropriate it freely. Doing so, the visitors simultaneously participate in the dissemination or the circulation and distribution of the work, as well in its disappearance. In the same way that posters function as souvenirs of exhibition we have seen, a title can only exist as an image, a monochrome image, because almost imperceptible, white on white, that articulates and substantiates loss and silence. It is not the words, the letters, or the meaning that strike us, but rather their motif as an image in the sense of a virtual spectral of displaced presence. The experience of disorientation, of withdrawal and exclusion that composes this work replicates not only the fate of the Armenians, but also of the spectator-visitor. There is, as always, an echo between what is proper to the catastrophe and to the work of art. In his work, Garabedian often uses domestic objects charged with biographic significance, sort of objets trouvés. In particular, he uses objects that are at once very concrete and spectral, material and spiritual, because of the diasporic context in which they operate. Garabedian has made many words that could qualify as diasporic, in the sense that he displays objects or figures that constitute hallmarks or emblems of the Armenian communities. The artist uses, mobilizes, and stages typically Armenian cultural object and motif in a very provocative and agitating way in order to punctuate and to interrogate the historical and emotional value of the object, and by extension, that which constitutes an artwork. So I'm going to show you some of this installation to display those typically objets souvenirs. For example, this is the installation gift t-shirts from 2009, obviously around t-shirts. Then another one is called Calendars, which is an ongoing installation, which is a collection of calendars with characteristic pictures of the cultural and national heritage, such as old churches, landscape, Mount Ararat, etc. Garabedian also created a sculpture in neon that displays the picture of Mount Ararat in an installation entitled Koseklener, sorry from Armenian, Speak Mountains, Tell Us Mountains in 2008. Then there is, and that's the last work I want to show you, Where is Mouche, Where is Van, a collection of geographical documents and historical maps. Indeed, Mouche and Van are the region where his grandparents came from, but also, as most of you know, the place that symbolize collective memory, as these are the place of persecution and resistance. All these objects and figures are memorial index that together offer a portrait of an equally real and artificial Armenia. Thus, because Caribbean revisits its heritage, its own history, in regard to the history of the plastic arts, we cannot reduce his work to an ethnic demonstration or to a national impulsion. The singularity of Garabedian's oeuvre then emerged out of this ongoing exchange between his personal memory and the memory of art. Garabedian and Torossian multiplicity of reference is not so much a postmodern strategy of citation, but rather the eagerness, if not the obsession, to look for signs and indexes that gather stable and identifiable points of reference. The signs of the Armenian heritage, be them cultural or catastrophic, accompany the signs of the history of art and images. I believe that the works by Torossian and Garabedian do not merely maintain or stigmatize stereotypes of fetishic images, but rather that they call them into question. Still, we might wonder if it's possible to get totally detached from the cliché, again in the double sense of the word, which are typical of diaspora and thus of genocide. Even if we might observe a certain instrumentalization of these images, this is nevertheless constantly complicated and problematized. What is more, the art practices call for a spectator who is active in the process of image making, of meaning making, a process in which the viewer is caught in a sort of archaeological work and duty, since he, she participate into the construction of the work. Remembering the Armenian genocide is a displacement in itself, to remember it outside the original and natal locus, and to remember it outside its original historical times. The artist's multiple visual work not only repetitively translate the way that genocide haunts Armenian in diaspora, but also allude to the idea that the heritage of the catastrophe, as I said, can only be imagined. The construction of memory of the genocide binds Armenians diaspora together, and this is expressed by archival desires refracted in the production and preservation of certain visual lexicon and iconographies. In other words, the image replaces and incarnates, so to speak, the original territory. The diasporic condition is defined by a need to anchor and to root the existence of the origin in a certain memorial representation. It is captured in a focalization on an idealized, emotional, and/or intellectual perception and expectation of Armenia. That is what we see, for instance, in the similarly natural and artificial geometrics of Torossian. Those imaginary acts nevertheless originate from real and actual event and experience. Torossian and Garabedian's filmic posture and gesture engage both their displaced biographic self, being of Armenian descent, and their filmic and plastic quest for capturing and chasing images. How does one visually speak about this genocide without having to prove that it actually took place? This is a very challenge for these artists. As I shall insist, the image should not have anything to prove, because such understanding would fall into the perverse logic of self-explanation and justification. Therefore, Torossian and Garabedian and Egoyan succeed, to my mind, in assembling images that simultaneously indicate the lack of available images of the catastrophe and respond to the perversity of the archival process by proposing other images that do not function as visual evidence. And I'm going to my conclusion. The films and the artworks I have discussed today refract what I called an aesthetic of displacement, both a displacement of history and a displacement of the artist's origin, but also a displacement of images. be it from one context to another, or from cultural icons to catastrophic icons. An aesthetics of displacement is thus understood as a subjective and historical experience, as well as an aesthetic strategy to recall past events that have barely entered the sphere of the visible. With a sense of belonging and foreignness, the artist displays and transports all sorts of visual codes and images, while pointing to the geographical, historical, but also generational and emotional displacements of the Armenian. In short, an aesthetic of displacement is a visual enterprise of an obsessive and repetitive yet lacunary necessity. Clearly, memory is constantly reconstructed and recreated. In other words, it is in becoming, or should I say, in constant weaving and texturing. With regard to the notion of missing images, the majority of the images I've shown you reveal the inversion of destruction into cultural and transcendental depositories, or icons of what survived. Or in the case of the film Ararat, for instance, we can say that when images are missing, they must be fabricated. In their works, Egoyan, Garabedian, and Tarosian recycle or recraft the iconographies of genocide, as well as the cultural lexicon, which are reinvented in other highly constructed visual territories. And it would be my last sentence. With all this being said, images are the necessary detours for remembering a culture that lacks images and that, as a result, has been weaving for generations its own tapestries and textures of memory. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. That was beautiful. Would you take some questions from us now? Yeah?
Yeah, if it was
So,
not too long.
Donna on one side and me on the other with microphones. If you just kindly raise your hand and we will pass the microphones. First person is always shy, so that is one of you just throw yourself out.
That was very clear, obviously. Oh, yes.
Thanks. That was a great talk and really interesting material to think about. And I have two questions. One is, you said toward the end that it was important that the images had nothing to prove.
Yes.
And that sounded like you speaking, like it's your norm. And I wonder if that's right. And so is that something you think is really important? Because you said at the beginning, and it's really about understanding what you're saying when I'm asking. Mm-hmm. At the beginning you said something like, if they set out to prove something, they would essentially be colluding with the perpetrators who set the rules.
Yeah.
I'd just like you to explain that more, because it doesn't immediately strike me as obvious and logical that, if a perpetrator perpetrates something and hides it, that showing it wouldn't be an act of resistance, which you seem to be excluding. So that would be my question, just in terms of understanding what you're And then the other one is just speculative, because this, especially the first set of work, seems very film-bound and very, you use the term collage and weaving and texture and handwork, and it's all very pre-digital. And I'm curious about what you have to say about these issues you're thinking about in the digital age, whether something happens to diasporic memory images as we move out of photographic and kind of handiwork avant-gardes into digital avant-gardes, whether you have any examples of that. Even in the work that you were showing last, it seems stuck in the age of television, and it's not, and in maps, it's not going, it's going back and retrieving the object, and there seems to be something important about the object, right? The tangibility of the object.
Yes.
And I wonder what happens to that as we move into more and more digital circulation of images.
Okay. To answer your first question, yes, when I say the image has nothing to prove, for me it's a very basic assumption I want to start with. For this reason that actually what I think very much characterized the Armenian genocide is actually this position of having to prove it. Especially with regard, for example, of the debate around the archives, you know, that has been a very long debate still today. And actually, this is my take for, I just want to give you a recent example of something that happened in Turkey where, you know, there is, of course, a lot of people saying, okay, let's talk together, let's sit at a table and let's discuss what happened. But while a lot of people think this is great, you know, it showed the openness, I don't think it's great, because I think that what qualifies a genocide is not about a dialogue. It's not something that you put into question. There is a perpetrator and a victim. So, and I think when you are caught in this kind of mood of, you know, yeah, I'm going to show you, you know, I'm going to show you the images and I'm going to prove you that it happened. You actually play, in a way, in that perverse archival, you know, death drive that Jacques Derrida is talking about. You know, that's something you have, it's always linked to destruction. And in a way, if you do so, you start off putting things into question. What is for me important is that the works I want to emphasize are not works that put the event into question, but how the event is represented, how the event circulates. So, of course, it doesn't mean that I disqualified, for example, documentary films, but we should always look at what is exactly the discourse behind it. And this is a bit linked, if I may already answer your second comment. What I notice very much when you look, for example, when you type Armenian genocide in Google or in YouTube, right, this is what we do, you will very often see that images very often play this evidentiary document, that it's used on a lot of activist websites in order, they're trying to assemble all kind of images in order to show, you see it really happened. And specifically, your question is extremely relevant, and I think that should be very seriously researched, exactly because, you know, digital media relies very much on those kind of images. So it's not so much that I want to favor more art practice, but I do think that those work in particular put that into question. And actually those two artists are also moving to digital, you know, way of making films. But the way, and now she's actually doing collage on a more, for example, Torosian on a more digital-based technique, so that's what she does. And in a way, this idea of textures of memory, which I started to think of in 1993, when she actually made a film and was really assembling, in a way can be found in other sort of things. So it's not just the hand in a physical sense. I think it's the idea of assembling, disassembling, putting things together, patchworking, puzzling, etc., which I believe is not just a strategy of, you know, avant-garde, of postmodernism, but also a way of putting, you know, piece together, and at the same time not doing it in order to kind of reconstruct the events themselves. So it's very important for me that those works do not fall into indeed what I call the perversity of proving, which of course it's a total different thing than when you study the Armenian genocide from a historical perspective, of course, or from a juridical perspective. And that should be done. But I just do think that when you work with the visuals, especially in this case, it can be tricky. Another example, which I've been very much participating to, it's a lot of manifestation for the recognition of genocide. If you notice, a lot of people in those manifestations, they always have this big, how do you say, pancartes, you know, billboards with also very graphic images. So you see all the time this, and it's always the same images. So for me, that was very, very significant of the event itself, of the lack of images, and to kind of, you know, sur-invest or overly invest the one that do exist and that are complicated also. But also to show another way of doing it within the Armenian communities. And in that sense, I discover, actually in the same order that I show you today, first the work of Arthur Egoyan, then a few years after the work of Terence, and more recently the work of Garid. And the three of them are actually doing that, in a way, by experiencing different visual media and trying to be constantly aware and conscious of what you do with images and for who you do it and how you do it. I don't know if it answers your question, Marco.
Through Egoyan's movie Ararat, right? I mean, I think one of Johannes's question speaks to the kind of strategies that you yourself have interpreted in Egoyan's Ararat, being a film within a film, right? And so maybe you can tell us a little bit about...
Yeah. So the film Ararat, I know that my students have seen the film. I know that some of you have seen the film as well. I know the film is problematic for many reasons. I know I have to, or at least it puts into question, you know, a lot of issues. But I do think what the film brilliantly does, it actually asks this typical question. By making a film within a film, it actually constantly reflects upon its own strategy, you know, by using this character of Saroyan, who is a sort of Steven Spielberg character, you could say. And what is interesting is that it's not so much saying that one representation is better than another one. It actually shows the wide range of possibilities of doing it and why people do that and what are the expectations. So in a way, it is a very enigmatic and maybe hermetic film, but it also offers a wide range indeed of possibilities, because there is, of course, his own film, the film by Saroyan, but there is also a lot of visual means in the film. You know, the video diary by Rafi, who make indeed a digital, you know, film out of what you have seen in Eastern Turkey. You have the painting by Gorky, you have the book by the historian. So everyone tried to make sense out of it within its own medium, right? Within its own generational, you know, experience. And Egoyan is not favoring one over the other. It just showed, you know, what are the various visual strategies that are... So I thought in that sense it was actually very interesting. What it also shows is that the genocide is not, and that's another assumption I really want to emphasize, not something of the past. What qualifies a genocide is that it's always something of the present, otherwise it would not be a genocide. And in a way that is what is also constitutive of what a genocide is in the first place. And that it kind of takes over and creates indeed that transgenerational trauma and that somehow you are caught in. And what I found interesting in the work of Egoyan in particular to start with is how he shows this kind of love-hate relationship with his Armenian identity because of that. Because that you like it or not, it's part of what you inherit, right? And I'm not saying that in an essentialist way, but just in the way that it gets transmitted very implicitly through, you know, many occurrences, but it also gets transmitted implicitly through a lot of visual. And also let's keep in mind that with the word images, we have also the idea of imagination, which is to picture, to be able to understand something that happened, but also the images of the survivor. So the word image is, to me, also a very interesting term and concept that kind of gathers all these different issues of trauma, of film, of remembering, of testimony, of archive.
So, thank you, Marie. That was beautiful. It's not a question so much as a comment, and I was interested in the figure of repetition. Mm-hmm. And I'm coming to this from thinking about another genocide, the Holocaust. And when you think about the images that are most known of the Holocaust, let's think the picture, the photograph of the Warsaw Ghetto with the kid in the raised hands, or the Buchenwald camp, you know, kind of at the moment of liberation, or Boltanski's, you know, kind of, you know, evocations of the Holocaust in his artwork, then, you know, kind of repetition comes in two ways. The one is we know these images, and that constitutes their iconic status, you know, kind of we recognize them immediately. But with that comes a certain fear of their devaluation as images. How do we keep them alive? Because they are so recognizable. And so there's that fear, you know, how do we keep that visual memory kind of working in the ways, in the shocking ways that, you know, people have responded when they were first maybe exposed to these images. And what was interesting about the function of repetition in your presentation, you know, kind of, it's a very different, you know, kind of version of weaving oneself into something where the iconic, you know, kind of space is left empty, and I wanted you to say a little bit more about that, you know, sort of that.
Yeah, it's, first of all, I'm very glad you bring this notion of repetition, because that's another commonality of the three artists I was discussing tonight. I think in one of my books, I have an entire chapter on repetition in the work of Haidostian, because that's one of the main features of his own work, you know. Repetition of the same motif, the same themes, the same actors, the same, even the same images, a lot of mirroring effect, the fact that most of the characters are caught in repetitive behavior, so it's all there. In the work of Garabedian, it's very clear with the fig A, and there is a lot of works that do that. In the work of Haidostian is the collage, you know, this constantly loop of the same images. But also more profoundly, repetition has also a lot to do with denial, in a sense. Because, of course, I'm going to put it in a much too simple way, but I do think that the fact that it's a genocide, as we all know, which is, you know, complicated, which is not easily acknowledged, creates exactly the transgenerational trauma I was talking about, which is defined by repetition, right? But related to what you said about those iconic images of the Holocaust that indeed, you know, construct or collective remembering of the Holocaust, what I wanted to emphasize is that in regard to the Armenian genocide, those do not have the same status. First of all, they do not have the same sort of images, not that, you know. So the repetition comes of this over and over fabrication of them, of over and over looking for them desperately somehow. So there is some sort of echo between the very being of this genocide with what is happening in the construction of memory and accordingly in the construction of images. So, but of course, I mean, on the other hand, the fact that the images you are talking about, I mean, they are Western memory, right? I mean, here we do not, I'm not saying that the Armenian genocide images should be part, but I think it's very significant of how the event itself has been defined and transmitted and disputed in history as well. So that's why I like to put always history, memory, and images together, because I think if you look at images, you know what kind of remembering culture and practice is at stake, or what sort of history those images actually refer to. So, and I think that repetition is indeed, it's a very interesting motif when you deal with genocide and when you deal with art in the first place, right? I mean, it's a well-known device, you know, in music, in film, in a lot of artwork, in the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze. What I'm saying all this is because all these features are also worked through in the work of Merita Garabedian. So I think it's a very important motif for those three artists, but once again, that explain why we, as Armenians in diaspora, obsessively look for those anchors, in a way. And images is one of this possible anchor.
Thank you. Maybe one last question. Did you want to? No, you're okay? No questions. All right. Well, thank you so much, Marie, for this.
Okay. Thank you very much for being here.